Digital innovation is accelerating across all industries and markets as companies invest to differentiate themselves. However, this also increases a company's risk. The digital attack surface is much broader across endpoints, network edges, and the cloud. Data breaches and ransomware continue to increase in sophistication. With Fortinet, trust you are protected everywhere your people, devices, and data are. Fortinet offers broad visibility across the entire attack surface, an integrated platform to reduce management complexity, and automation for fast and efficient operations. Fortinet, making possible a digital world you can always trust.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a great schedule today where we will be talking about ransomware detection, response, and recovery with a focus, of course, on ANZ. And with us today, I have Glenn Maiden, Director of Threat Intelligence from FortiGuard Labs ANZ.
Hi, Cornelius. It's great to be here. Looking forward to an interesting discussion today.
And we also have Mark Robson, and he's the Senior Technical Threat Analyst that will taking us through also the presentation today on the changes that we see on ransomware.
Hey gents, happy to be here.
Now for the guys that join online, it might be better to view your screen using your laptop than it might be using your mobile device. Also, for more information on what we're covering in this webinar, please check out the downloadable resources listed. You can also already easily register for our next webinar, which is going to be FortiEDR demo happening on the 24th of August by using and register using the link on your right. Also, please feel free to ask questions during the session, and we will do our best to answer them or come back to you on these questions as soon as possible. But hey, let's start today's presentation.
Look, I think ransomware is a tough one. I mean, it's obviously is one of the greatest threats in the cyber sort of security space at the moment. So it's absolutely prolific. And the sad news is that the ransomware gangs are very, very successful and aren't sort of slowing down. So we are making a little bit of progress, but you know, the reality is the ransomware and even the cyber criminal ecosystem is extremely sophisticated. So there's it's very, very mature. There's lots of different players within there, and this sort of came to the fore even just this week when we saw a rare leak from one of the insiders into one of the main ransomware gangs called Conti. And one of the things that we've seen is most ransomware attacks these days, they're not actually conducted by the core criminals. Obviously, they don't want to expose themselves to that level of risk. So the core criminals who are actually writing the ransomware are working with what they call affiliates, who are the other criminals who are actually doing the ransomware campaigns like we see with things like Colonial Pipeline and JBS Meatwork. So it's these affiliates that are actually, in a lot of cases, are actually the ones running the campaigns. So what happens is the affiliates typically get paid about 70% of the ransom that gets negotiated. But this week, obviously, with the Conti affiliate, we find out that he's aggrieved because he feels like he's been underpaid. So he posted into a cybercrime forum a little bit of a sort of a handbook or a playbook about some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the Conti ransomware crew. So the post basically had things like operations tools, operations methodologies, scanners, exploits, credential dumpers, and advice on how to avoid AV. So really, really quite mature. And while this particular manual in this case doesn't give us enough information to irreparably damage Conti, it really does show just the level of sophistication of the adversary that we're facing. And Conti's only just one of many, many, many other ransomware entities in that ransomware cyber criminal ecosystem, Corne.
I think that flows perfectly onto what we want to talk about today as well, right? So we want to see how that overlays with the strategy that we see businesses are looking at. We'll talk more about threat intelligence, and then I want to hand over also to Mark to talk about ransomware and his view and his perspective on that. And I think that's spot on with what you've mentioned. You know, we really talk about that a lot, about what are the strategies that we need, and we need to have something in place before we need that. And when we're looking at ransomware, there's no exception to that. And when we look at the strategic advantages, a lot of the times, Glenn, we talked about that, about the impact on regulation and compliance, how that really has an impact on the metrics that we use within the business. And from that capability as well, I think it's really important to see what are some of the changes that we see then based on the threat landscape. And if we look at that, one of the big components that we see on the ransomware, and again, just make it aware for the people that's here in Australia, is just looking at what the Shadow Minister Tim Watts is talking about. He's introducing the Private Members Bill for federal parliament, and it's again focusing to help businesses to really be equipped and help with the new cost that we see from paying ransomware and cyber attacks. Glenn and Mark, I want to ask you guys a question. What is that impact there that you see within the industry? Do you see this as the right direction of doing it? Do you think this is something that will really help people to get the advantage or the unfair advantage that we sometimes talk about when looking at these threat vectors?
Well, I'll go first, Kwame. From my perspective, as you know, the advice from security experts like Fortinet, or whether it's a government cyber security emergency response team, the advice is always never ever pay a ransom. But the reality is that a lot of organisations find themselves painted into a corner where that's the only choice that they've got. So, again, I've spoken with you before about how much I dislike sort of victim shaming some of these organisations that have been brought to their knees by ransomware. But I think the key thing and the message that we're always pushing and trying to get right front and center is that we need to make sure that you're prepared and prepared early, because that's going to be the best position to be in. So you're not in that space where you have to be thinking about whether you're going to pay a ransom or not.
Mark, before we go on with the presentation, I would love to have your view on that as well from an analyst by looking at this detail. Do you think this is something that's very much new tactics that the guys are coming out, or do you think that using cyber hygiene from the beginning can really help to protect businesses?
A lot of the times where we see ransomware employed, it's not obviously in isolation, and it's really just looking at the kill chain. It's the last step, all right? So what we should be looking for at making robust techniques that are applied to all different actors and different types of intrusions, rather than just ones that end with the deployment of ransomware. If we are running a secure system, then you can help preempt those initial steps that lead up to the deployment of ransomware.
Mark, that's really good. And I also want to bring that in, that we sometimes talk about the maturity levels. If we look at the Eisenhower model to talking about, what is the most important thing, and do that first versus, the things that's urgent and not important. How do we overlay that? And also, I really believe it's important how we can look at that from a passive defense to an active defense by looking at building maturity into the business. So I believe that Fortinet with a fabric approach can really help also with the initial security to the managed level, to how do we monitor and actually optimize the business itself. Now, with the question on that, Glenn, I wanted to ask you a question as well, to just give us a bit more information from FortiGuard Labs and how you guys are driving and helping businesses to secure their environments.
Yeah, Cornelius. So, I mean, it's a great question. So FortiGuard Labs, for those that haven't run into us previously, we're the threat intelligence and research component of the Fortinet fleet. So as many of you know, Fortinet, we're very, very famous for our next-gen firewall, but not only do we have a product catalog of the firewall, we have endpoint detection and response, which Mark's going to be talking about in a little bit more detail shortly. We've got email filters, we've got web filters, we've got one almost of every single cyber security tool. And we've got those deployed to literally millions of customers across the world. So, all that telemetry is trickling back into our threat systems to give us a really, really good idea of the threat. So, one of the biggest jobs for FortiGuard Labs is to go through, analyze the threat, and then come up with processes and signatures and rules and all those things that we then push out into back into those that Fortinet product catalog, making a bit of a virtuous circle or a virtuous loop. And one of the cool things about that is, going back to your previous slide, talking about that maturity level. If you look at ransomware, a lot of the victim industry verticals that are affected and affected extremely badly are verticals like health, where they don't have a lot of maturity. So, if you're not mature enough potentially to have or you're not large enough organization to have, a really robust security capability, you still are deriving some benefit by having, just a simple firewall where that threat intelligence is fed into that firewall every day in, every day out.
And I also want to ask you a question about the activity. What are some of the activity that you've seen from a ransomware perspective, and how does that correlate to what we're seeing this year in 2021?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Now, I do apologise. These are some ransomware statistics from last year. So a bit of a plug, our next threat landscape report's coming out in the next month or so. So we're going to be having a bit of a look at what's happened in the last sort of 12 months. But a couple of interesting points here. So I just mentioned the healthcare sector of absolutely being smashed by ransomware. But if you have a look on that chart on the left, there's a whole bunch of other industries that are being affected as well, more than healthcare, manufacturing, logistics, government, education. So a whole bunch of these different industry verticals are being absolutely brought to their knees by ransomware. The second chart there just shows a massive, it's about a 7 times increase, in ransomware events sort of December last year. Now, I'm still not quite certain what caused that spike, but looking at the cyber criminal, ecosystem, now some people think they're doing $6 trillion worth of business a year with $20 billion just in ransomware payments alone. So, this is a very lucrative business, especially in the time of the pandemic where, there's a lot of people sort of struggling and working from home.
And also, if we look at the evolution right now, I know that if we look at some of these malware that we see, or the ransomware that we see in here, I know in a lot of these components, we shouldn't get too excited about it. And I've got the Ragnar as an example. As the next thing, so I'll talk about some of the processes there. But what are some of the other, I want to say, the other evolution that you've seen that was really impactful in the business in the last year?
Yeah, so we're tracking a few different, sort of trends and evolutions in ransomware at the moment. Even just this last sort of week or two, we've noticed that some of the ransomware varieties are even sort of scanning victim machines, looking for cyber insurance documentation, so to aid them in, deciding how much of a ransom to actually ask that same victim. So they're getting very sophisticated. But if you look in the bottom right there, the three major threats, the three major trends, I should say, that we've seen over the last sort of 12 months. OT threat, so I've mentioned up there sort of the ECANS malware. So, there's malware that's specifically designed now to be able to also impact on OT type systems. Big game hunting is another one. So where we've seen the ecosystem start to get quite sophisticated. In the older days, when I mentioned some of those affiliates earlier on, they'd just go out and they'd sort of, they'd get some sort of a mailing list from somewhere off the darknet or whatever, and then just sort of do a bit of a scattergun approach where the big game hunting, philosophies come in now because they know they can make more money out of it. So they're looking at who's the main player in an organization, what's the main critical infrastructure in an organization, and how can they impact those type of things to cause the most amount of damage and then demand the greatest ransom. But to me, that the third one, which is the hybrid data theft type of operational priority or operational way of working, is probably the most nefarious. So in that scattergun approach, you could argue that you don't need that sophisticated a threat actor, especially if they're one of these affiliates that are basically just leveraging these sophisticated tools that someone else has written for them. But if you're talking about data theft where a threat actor needs to exploit a network, move laterally throughout that victim organization, identify information that is of value, exfiltrate that information without actually being caught by anyone, and then running the ransomware campaign. That's actually quite a sophisticated operation and quite a sophisticated threat actor that's traditionally been more associated with the nation state type of threat. So, these ransomware campaigns are getting much, much more sophisticated in both the software they're using and the people that are actually conducting them.
I want to go into some of the questions as well there for you, Mark, and I know we're going to go into a bit more detail on that in the presentation. But looking at these techniques that Glenn was talking about, is this new techniques that the guys are using, or is this still very much old school that the guys are using to get that infiltration into the networks first?
So we have to look at it from two aspects, really. So we've got to look at what Glenn was talking about with the overall campaign that leads to the deployment of ransomware, and then the techniques that are actually employed by the ransomware samples and the malware themselves. We've seen a bit of change in both. Most notably is big changes in the ransomware and how it actually goes about doing what it does. A lot of that is based around, changing the way that it behaves, so it can block products like EDR-based, behavioral-based indicators. But what we've seen less of a change in as we've moved to a more commercialization and the more, I guess, robust and quick expansion of these businesses, if we want to call them businesses, is that they're needing to be consistent with their techniques that they're applying to gain access to and then lead up to pre-position themselves ready to deploy the ransomware. So because of that, a lot of the mitigations that you can put in place in your environment, they're not always novel. And when we see new novel techniques that come out that actors are then employing to drop their ransomware and detonate it in an environment, it's only a small piece of the overall kill chain. So if we are still applying mitigations across majority of it and using mitigations that detect across everywhere, then we can still be effective. Right? They're not bringing a whole new set of TTPs every week, right? They're developing and evolving over time.
Can you just share a bit more information around FortiGuard and the MDR services and what we do from that perspective to help businesses?
Yeah, so my team and I, we form the Managed Detection and Response team, which is under FortiGuard 40 Responder Service. And so we provide 24/7 support to 40 EDR customers. So we're an additional service, but the benefits that you get from MDR, we try to extend those as much as we can to all of our EDR customers. So my team and I look at new emerging threats and help the dev teams behind the scenes to make sure that we are continually updating our TTP detections so that we can effectively mitigate those new threats. We also help out our customers with containment and remediation and reporting and alerting requirements that often come with that.
And with that, I want to move into the section I think that's going to be, I want to say, most interesting from this aspect as well, right? If we're looking at ransomware, what are some of the components that really stand out? And Glenn, you had the Ragnar in one of your slides there, the Ragnar Locker ransomware. And just as an example, right, one of the things that we've seen here, and this is not a new thing if we're looking at what they're doing, is that escalation privileges. We know that's one of the big components is also like, how can we protect? Again, brings back the need for looking at things such as zero trust. It brings back again the component from using two-factor authentication where applicable. We can take that back to the frameworks, both from an ASD perspective or even from an ISO standard perspective, right? So again, we can see that really helps with that initial component that people use to exfiltrate within the businesses. The second part there is reconnaissance, and I think this is quite important as well with what are the tools that the guys are using or the threat vectors are using when they're in the network, when they escalate themselves as an admin. What do they do then, and what access do they have, and what are the privileges they use from that aspect? I think one of the things there that they did, Mark, was quite, I want to say it's quite interesting, right? I think that was the first time we've really seen what they were doing from a payload perspective, where they would actually use an MSI to download a virtual machine, and the virtual machine itself had the malware affected in it. And the malware, was 122 megabytes installer. The virtual image was under 300 meg, and the payload itself from the ransomware executable was about 49 kilobytes. So again, it's very small compared to the impact what the guys would then do. But as they were moving through the environment, they again looked at what are the backups that's there. And one of the things we know people are looking at is making backups of your environment and storing it off site as well. So it's not just having backups in the environment, because what this vector did is again looking at backups, deleting the backups that they had, and only then is they would deploy their ransomware manually, but focusing on their targets and have a ransomware specific for the targets before they would demand any money. Mark, I would love your view and your comments on this. Do you think this is something that we can keep on seeing people are doing, or do you think the techniques from what we've seen from Ragnar will change?
Yeah, so as we've adapted as defenders, pushing, we constantly talk about what mitigations can you apply for ransomware. One of the big ones that we pushed in the last couple of years is make sure you've got solid backups. What we're seeing now, as we would expect, is we're seeing the adversaries then adapt in turn and start trying to look for those backups so they can mitigate our defenses. All right. Well, I expect to see a lot more of that coming up. These more, I guess, comprehensive intrusions. What we'll probably start to see in the future is the further move to the extortion, which is as we get better at mitigating ransomware, we start seeing, that double, the 1-2 punch of them ransomwaring. And if you can effectively mitigate that, then they'll try to on-sell your data so that they can still get something out of those intrusions. That also gets around a lot of the quite intrusive and easily detected behaviors that are associated with ransomware. They can sneakily get in and out and then just sell your data. Then maybe we start seeing emergence more of that as a primary technique. Yeah, so looking at the cyber kill chain from our perspective or from the victim's perspective, really the areas we focus on are from delivery to act on objectives. Weaponization and to an extent, reconnaissance happen outside of our visibility. We can do things, and I know FortiGuard Labs work pretty hard on, mapping those current trends and identifying, large scale recon, but predominantly we focus on that right-hand side. All right, so the FortiEDR, we aim to provide, I guess, layers of defense at each of these steps of the kill chain, so that if the adversary does come up with a novel way of progressing through one of them, we're still able to detect them at later ones. And so even with the new 0 days that have come out this year, we saw those exchange ones at the start of the year. We saw Kaseya that came through, which is, again, they're quite different approaches, where the EDR and the MDR service were still able to provide that mitigation, because any post-exploitation activity, which is where it stops being novel and they start using known techniques, we're able to effectively detect and mitigate.
And one of the components that we look at a lot from a framework perspective, and we hear more and more customers and partners are looking at that, is the MITRE attack framework. What do you see are the differences between looking at the kill chain and the MITRE attack framework? And do you have, can we say, a favorite one that you would reference?
Yeah, so I think they've both definitely got merit, and they've both got a place when it comes to the whole cybersecurity sphere. I think when it comes to developing mitigations and detections, you're best to focus on the MITRE attack framework. Now that's mainly because it aims to be comprehensive. So it aims to capture all techniques under the tactics, but what it kind of struggles with is when we're looking at a live intrusion and trying to position where the adversary might be, and to work out how we can start being proactive based off an ongoing intrusion. All right, so as you can see from the MITRE that you've got up here on the screen, there's a lot of different tactics, and each one of those has a whole bunch of techniques. Not all of those need to be completed for the adversary to progress through the kill chain or to get their actions on target. So it can be a bit daunting when you're looking at this. So what you want to try to consider is looking at the kill chain, working out what elements of that are really focused to you and what areas you would like to mitigate to get the best bang for buck, and then coming across to the MITRE and using that to check coverage when you're a bit more further down the path.
Now, for the guys that's online, we are going to be looking at more details on the FortiEDR in a demo in the end of August. So again, all of the detail will be in the downloadable resource listed. So please have a look at that, and you can start to register as well to see how we can do that and what it will look like. But Mark, can you take us through an example of some of these processes that you would see? So from an analyst perspective, what do you see are some of the benefits of looking at a EDR solution and why that is important?
So this here, this is a screenshot. So before I talked about TTPs that might be employed leading up, involved with an entire intrusion associated with a ransomware-based intrusion. These events here that are on screen is just a quick screenshot of what the EDR interface might show you after ransomware has been dropped and then as it executes. So in this particular situation here, the EDR was in simulate mode, so it didn't block any of the activity, and detonating it in a test environment like this and seeing what it does really lets us observe some of the events or the malicious behavior that is triggered by an EDR. So all of these EDR events, they're not blocking the ransomware itself. What they're blocking is the behavior that the ransomware attempts to conduct. So that means if the ransomware changes the hash, its file name, how it executes, that's irrelevant because what we're trying to block on here is particular activity. Okay, so a couple of the ones that are outlined here, this is as it's named aptly, it's the Darkside sample. All right, so we can see it modifying OS registry settings. So that's it manipulating the registry to change the desktop background at the end of encryption. We could see sensitive information access as it tries to dump credentials, service access as it attempts to access the volume shadow copies, trying to hit those backups. We see network communications and obviously file read and file delete attempts associated with the encryption process.
I want to ask a question there, if I may. If we look at ransomware, and again, it's a very big focus that we see from a marketing perspective in the media, and people are talking about that. So we see a lot of that. Is ransomware the end result? Is that the first thing we should focus on, or are there other priorities that we should focus on to actually mitigate the ransomware itself?
Well, ransomware doesn't just appear on the system, all right? If you look at the kill chain and you work out what part ransomware is, the actual deployment and execution of ransomware is the last step in the kill chain, and it's the last tactic in the MITRE attack framework, all right? If you're focused on that last point, kind of because it's the flavor of the week, then you're probably missing everything at the start. And with ransomware, as you know, they've changed the signatures, and I talked about how they're rapidly changing the techniques they go through to actually encrypt the endpoint. There's a lot of change there. There's better bang for buck further on the left-hand side. And not only will you be mitigating the ransomware-based intrusions, but you'll be mitigating other types of intrusions. So if companies trying to compromise your infrastructure to use that to pivot, maybe just to steal and exfil data, you can mitigate all of those by mitigating common techniques further to the left of the kill chain.
Glenn, in your view, what is the impact from your perspective that you've seen on Darkside?
Yeah, look, I think even going back to Mark's previous comment about looking to the left of the actual ransomware event itself, one of the other important things is actually mitigating the damage. So if we look at sort of, Darkside, you mentioned the most sort of famous one, which is the Colonial Pipeline. So, that shut off the fuel for the top east coast of the US for sort of several days, and it was absolutely huge in terms of impact. But going to the right of that, had Colonial gone through and done a little bit of preparation, like so potentially getting their access and identity management strategy right and making sure that the privileges were minimized, maybe multi-factor authentication for things like service accounts or administration accounts, things like network segregation. And we mentioned before with regards to having the offline backups that have been tested and very, very rapidly able to be accessed and restored. The impact of Darkside in that particular case, even though that campaign would have been 100% successful and the ransomware executed, they would have been able to recover much quicker. So again, going back to my earlier comment, this is why it's so important that this is looked at as a whole, as Mark says. Look at your environment, look at your threats, and look at the assets that you're trying to protect in a holistic manner. And think about the worst case and how you can make sure that even if that worst case does happen, we want to get the risk of that down to almost zero. How can we make sure that worst case is not as worse as as it was for Colonial or JBS or some of the Kaseya victims?
What would you say are the 6 steps that's really important to help with the security hygiene? And we normally talk about the people, processes, and platforms. And within Fortinet, we've done a study on that as well to look at how we can integrate a lot of those components together. And we see a need to bring those things together. But with a focus on ransomware and really help to mitigate that, I would love your view, Mark and Glenn, on what do you guys see as the top priority and bringing those things together using the Fortinet Fabric approach?
Well, I guess from my view, Cornelius, we were speaking about this before, obviously, Mark and yourself and me, I don't think that this is something that's necessarily prioritized in terms of a list or necessarily sequentials. So, we have to do all these things and we have to do all these things in parallel. But for me, I guess sort of harking back to my previous comment, the most important thing is to actually look at your organization and be proactive in taking the steps to protect it. So, I think it's really important that we understand, what's the critical assets that our organization needs to protect, and who are the who are the threat actors and what are the main risks to my organisation and to those assets. So in many cases, and we've seen that so many times across so many different verticals, our key assets and the key threat is basically organised crime trying to go through and lock them all up and then demand a ransom out of us. So if that's going to be the key threat, then there is mitigations that we can take. So I think just really stepping back and having a plan, a proactive plan, and then starting to embark on that maturity journey, I should say, is the most important thing, because every single step, every single control, every single protection that you put in is going to make you that much more resilient and lower that risk incrementally.
And one of the things that you mentioned as well, Mark, is the importance of having a plan ready. Talking about strategy as well. And you mentioned that importance of having incident response built in. Now, I know incident response is part of your team. Is there a story that you can share about the importance of that and how you've really helped one of our customers, specifically around getting them up and running before it was too late?
Yeah, so we see obviously a broad cross-section of customers and at various levels of preparation. The ones that we see succeed are the ones who've either unfortunately been compromised previously and had to pay the price, whether that be through a ransom or through a loss of data. We see them being significantly better prepared. That puts the value on like a tabletop type exercise. But really, the thing that stood out with them is everyone, when things went wrong, was clearly able to articulate where they fitted in and what actions that they could take and left and right of arc. If customers don't really have that, then they're really going to struggle. Now, in the ransomware, that's even more relevant, especially if you haven't incorporated something like an EDR, which gives you automated response, all right, which we can then analyze the results afterwards when the dust settled. If you aren't running something like that and you don't have clear communication, even if you are able to effectively identify some indicators at, further up the kill chain or to the left of the kill chain, if you aren't able to action those before the adversary gets to the point they can employ actions on objective, you've effectively lost, and there was no point in detecting anyway, because that ransomware is going to get deployed in your environment. You're not going to be able to succeed. So if you can't automate, at least practice and make sure those communications are there. If you can automate, highly recommend having those actions there as well, because you can clean these incidents up quickly and we can win.
I like that you've mentioned that, and I think an important aspect there is if we bring that also back into the zero trust capabilities. If we're looking at just that capability from knowing who's on your network, what's on your network, and what's the changes in there, and I think it comes down to the complexity. If we just talk about trust, right? Because we normally talk about how do we trust people around us, and you can take it back even to Caesar, right? Like, what is that implications from trust? But I think it's really important there. If we look, for instance, at some of the malware, if you use a Ragnar as an example, when you have a system and there's a new VM that gets spun up in your environment and try to be administrator and look in your environments, having a solution such as your network access control or a NAC, it really helps to give you the visibility. If there is a new asset in your environment, you want to know about those components as soon as possible. Another component, as an example, is if you have a printer that all of a sudden want to connect to a database, you want to have visibility of those new challenges and changes. So having a zero trust capability and a framework around that can really help to build more resilience into your business. And part of that is what I believe is really important, to build a culture for that. And I think it's easier said than done. Glenn, I would love your view on that. If we talk about cyber culture, how easy do you think and impactful is it within a business?
Oh, look, I think it's really important. It is definitely getting better. I mean, I even think back to sort of several years ago where I was in the security team that sort of sat in the back office, and most of us thought if they didn't think that we were just a hindrance to business, they actually thought that we were they thought that we were a cost of doing business. So security was really not seen as a value add. I think now with the impact of some of these cyber security incidents just becoming so profound, I think that that's changed, and I don't think that there's I don't think there's too many cowboys these days. I mean, they're definitely still there, and we've got a long way to go in terms of lifting sort of overall cyber maturity. But I personally think it's probably more a case of sort of finite resources and and a lot of sort of operational priorities that's sort of crueling things rather than the intent to do the wrong thing. So I think getting that culture right and leading from the top and making sure that cybersecurity is actually that sort of value add to your business, and that discriminates you from your competitors, because they know that you've got a really, really strong cybersecurity culture and a cybersecurity posture that will make your business stronger. I think it's actually a win-win for everybody.
And Mark, if there is one more takeaway that you would give the customers and partners that's listening online, what would that be?
Okay, so the main takeaway point that I would add just on the end of here is I would probably say we always talk about the layered approach. It's more and more relevant here. If we apply that to what we're talking about with ransomware, if you have the layers of defense to mitigate those higher end, those common parts of the kill chain, those common parts of the MITRE attack framework, you're going to be able to effectively mitigate ransomware. All of those steps that lead to ransomware deployment is what we should be focusing on. If your detections are focused on identifying ransomware as it executes, you've missed the brief, especially if things move towards more of this extortion focus.
Guys, I think that was a really good information. I really appreciate both of you guys taking the time to share this information, and also for the people that's online for taking the time and listening to this webinar. Now, we will be sharing a recording of the session also for your reference, and you're still welcome to reach out to us even after today's webinar. We will still be available online, so please feel free to still ask questions online if there's any questions that you have that you feel is not answered. And also just a reminder to check out the downloadable resources listed, and we will have some time also, again, like I said, to answer some of your questions online. And if you haven't registered, you can still register already for the 40 EDR demo happening on the 24th of August by using and register the link that's on your right. I'm Cornelius Marie, CISA for Australia. Thanks again for joining. Lights out.